So I want to start, I just want to point out in the secondary title, Challenging Psychoanalytic Understandings of Organizations, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's sort of ambiguous. One meaning is the one Sherry spoke to so elegantly yesterday, which is that organizations find psychoanalytic understandings challenging because they challenge the command and control, ultra-rationalist viewpoint that prevails there. But there's another meaning of this, which is challenging the psychoanalytic understandings. And I don't know if that was in the minds of the organizers, but in part I'll be speaking to that side of things. And I think it gives another sort of answer to Sherry's question of why it is not taken up as much as it might be. So to begin with, I'm mindful that I'm speaking in Spain, in English, to a mix of people from across the world, and I'm speaking on my preoccupations that have arisen from in my socio-cultural context, the UK. Of course, when I left the UK on Thursday morning, it was a very different place to when I returned there today. I don't know if you know the street artist Banksy in Bristol. Well, I was just emailed this yesterday. And so this is on the street. UKIP, in case you don't know, is the Little Englander Party. So anyway, my hope is that despite me speaking from my context, you will find sufficient resonances with your working context. So for more than 70 years now, governments and institutions across the world claim to have been battling against unfair discrimination, processes that centrifuge certain kinds of people to the periphery, making it harder for them to prosper in the workplace. But despite the time, effort and money spent over decades, in many respects the situation is little changed. For example, this newspaper headline, 14,000 professors but only 50 are black. Another tells us that only 1.6% of conductors and 4.1% of composers in the BBC proms were women. Outgroups continue to be victimized by the very authorities that are meant to protect and defend them. Police are up to 28 times more likely to stop and search black people. How and why is it that despite the fact that there are a number of very powerful anti-discrimination laws in place in the UK and elsewhere, injustices continue to take place in broad daylight? So my paper constitutes a partial answer to this, and it's structured in the following way. First, I'll say something about a range of social movements that have taken up these themes. Then I'll spend a little time on the psychoanalytic understanding of things. I'll then give an account of how these themes have been taken up by the legislature and implemented by human resources and organizational bureaucracies. So that's broadly the structure of it. So I start in the 1960s with multiculturalism. Multiculturalism was of the view that prejudice was born of ignorance. It was presumed that we naturally fear the unfamiliar. And it is this fear that drives us to treat other people badly. Well, if it's unfamiliarity that's a problem, the solution is familiarization, getting to know the ways and cultures of other people. And the assumption is that once we have familiarized ourselves, we'll be less inclined to treat them badly. And so we end up with the adage, different but equal. Well, there's much to be said for this paradigm, but in itself it is neither sufficient nor full enough. For example, the females of a society are not unfamiliar to the males of that society. They share lives of intimacy and live in the same culture. Yet we find that women are marginalized and do much less well. So whatever the causes of this, it is not to do with ignorance about their exotic cultures, as the multiculturalists think of it. What of the psychoanalytic explanations? Well, in my second book, I detail this, but this is a kind of a 5-point summary. So the first psychoanalytic explanation for racism and sort of prejudice and this sort of thing is transference. And it's in the sense that Freud first spoke of it, repeating without remembering. So if early development was repeatedly experienced as traumatic, then the adult is likely to behave in disturbed, hostile, perhaps racist ways in adult life. The second explanation draws on the individual-group dichotomy, which proposes that racism is some kind of group phenomenon that sweeps up the individuals in its path through something called contagion. And it is surmised that when in groups, individuals lose their civilized sensibilities and revert to some primeval savage state. The third explanation says that we are driven to act in these ways by our biology. Our instincts are such that we instinctually hate difference. The fourth explanation says that these phenomena arise when we recapitulate early developmental stages. And there's several of these in the psychoanalytic literature, one of them being the one about stranger anxiety. So infants at around the age of 6 months have this experience which we call stranger anxiety. And it is surmised in the literature that in adult life, this stage gets reactivated, and this is why we come to feel fear of strangers in adult life. But this way about talking about strangers is kind of asocial. It suggests that we have this sort of response to all kinds of strangers. But a stranger knocking unexpectedly at the door will elicit very different associations and responses depending on whether it is a young black man or a white man in a suit. It will also depend on who is opening the door, and it will also depend on where the door is. In other words, you cannot leave the social context out of the analysis, and if you do, it becomes reductive. The thing is, we are not just strangers to each other, we are also simultaneously familiars. Right now, I am similar to you by virtue of at least one attribute, and in this very same moment, I am different to you by virtue of at least one other attribute. So, similarity and differences are not opposites. The experience of similarity and difference can always be deconstructed. For example, in this moment, do you experience me as similar or different to you? Well, what is this experience based on? Colour, politics, profession? If you experience me as similar, why? And what have you done with the differences? And if you experience me as different, why? And what have you done with the similarities? The fifth psychoanalytic explanation, and by far the most common, features the mechanisms of splitting, repression, and projection. And so I have some internal disturbance which I cannot cope with, say aggression, so I split it off, repress it, and project it into some other being, and now I come to experience this person as aggressive, and so I feel aggressive towards them or fearful towards them. Well, some of these theories do work, but in a limited way at the level of particular individuals. They might explain why it is this, the history of this or that particular individual, and through that why this person comes to develop these sorts of hateful feelings towards blacks or some other group of people. However, it does not explain how and why it is that whole societies, whole groups of people should simultaneously come to hold similar views. How is it that the projective mechanisms of whole societies come to be so finely synchronized? Why is it in one context it's black people and another Protestant? Well, one sort of answer found in the psychoanalytic literature to these challenges is to say that these groupings have been already previously sanctioned as deserving of projections. They're already denigrated. This sort of theory says that the psychological mechanisms of individuals exploit pre-existing social conditions to manage internal psychological difficulties. I think there's some truth in this, but what it doesn't engage with is the central question, how those social conditions came to be generated in the first place. So we can see then that both the multiculturalists and the psychoanalysts think that knowledge is a solution to the problem of unfair discrimination. The difference between the two positions is that the multiculturalists think that it is through gaining knowledge of the other, information about your culture and your customs, that change will follow. Whilst the psychoanalyst thinks that it is through gaining knowledge of the self that change will occur. The work of multiculturalism is in the conscious world, and the work of psychoanalysis is in the unconscious world. However, both these paradigms are not only individualistic, they are internalist and apolitical. Just a collection of quotes from a range of psychoanalysts who say this sort of, who basically, the psychoanalytic line is that the social is generated by the psychological. The psychological is prior to the social. And we have clients saying the individual's personality is the foundation of social life. We have Fairbairn saying all sociological problems are ultimately reducible to problems of individual psychology, and so on. So in the 1970s and 80s in Great Britain, there was another movement called antiracism, and they accused the psychoanalysts of psychologizing problematic social difficulties, and they dismissed the multiculturalist thesis as naive and mistaken. The anti-racists charged both with not taking sufficient account of power relations, which they said drove the processes of oppression and marginalization. They argued that rather than put energy into psychoanalyzing the oppressors or into spending time educating them, one should challenge and change the power structures of the nation. Well, their militancy did bring about many positive changes in the British society, but they too lived in too polarized a world, too black and white a world. So they had this formula, which is racism equals power plus prejudice. And on this basis, they agreed that black people might be prejudiced, and all people have prejudice, but by definition they couldn't be racist because they did not have power. So, and so only whites can be racist. But by speaking of power in this way as something that one possesses, I have it and you don't, or vice versa, they gave the impression of power as a thing, and so they reified it. So it's at this point the diversity movement makes its entry, claiming to speak for all disenfranchised groups. However, it depoliticizes the difficulties by decoupling culture from politics. The diversity agenda is keen to say that it is not interested in politics, its focus is culture, and it reframes the issue to say that differences are not problems but assets. And because differences are assets, they should be celebrated. And this is how we get to the diversity strapline that we see everywhere today, celebrating diversity. Well, multinational corporations have been keen to pick up on the celebrating diversity agenda in a way they were not so keen with the previous movements of anti-racism and multiculturalism. And the reason that they were happy to pick this one up because the diversity agenda promises to benefit everyone. Diversity rhetoric is neoliberalist. It claims that its principles will lead to the cake itself getting bigger and everyone will get more, the rich and the poor. This makes it appealing to the already well-to-do, to the boardroom. No sacrifices involved. Here, there is only gain, no pain. In this way, the diversity movement avoids engaging the problematics of power differentials between groupings. For example, what has the celebration of diversity to do with the fact that the black population in the UK does less well in housing, education, and the workplace? The thorny issues to do with power relations are forgotten in the miasma of celebration. So there are two key problems with the diversity agenda. First, it doesn't take up the subjects of oppression and marginalization, and nor does it take up the question of what we are supposed, or how we are supposed to celebrate differences that conflict with our moral codes. Now I'll just move to the legislature. So in the UK, over the last half of the 20th century as a result of what were called race riots. A number of very powerful laws were put in place, the Race Relations Acts. And just to say a little bit about it, curiously, the Race Relations Act do not offer a definition of race, and nor do they name any of the races. Well, they cannot, they don't do it because they cannot, because there are no such things as races. So what they do is they leave it up to case law to establish what is and is not a race. So in the current state is that the following are races: Sikhs, Jews, Romani, Gypsies, Irish travellers, and Afro-Caribbeans. No other category has managed to establish itself as a race. So in 1993, despite all these acts and so on, there was the tragic murder of the innocent black teenager Stephen Lawrence. The Macpherson inquiry into the murder and its aftermath revealed what was more shocking than the murder even was the racism endemic in the police force, which led them to colluding with the murderers and targeting the black family and black friends of the victim. As a consequence of this inquiry, another law called the Amendment to the Race Relations Act was put in place, and it was a very powerful piece of legislation because it's a game changer. So for a start, it says that you have to start from the presumption that the structures of your institution are already biased. That would apply to this institution too. You start from that presumption. And then you have to investigate it. You have to publish strategies and statements about your intentions, and you are also meant to then collect data to demonstrate how you're making changes in the right direction. Well, as I'll show, institutions spend a lot of time on 2 and 3 with very little effect. So institutions are obliged to do this, or else they will be breaking the law. So all of this is taking place. Organisations produce and make public equal opportunity statements. For example, this one from the civil service, which is the kind of thing you would see everywhere. It's typical. So I'll go to data now. Bureaucrats, policymakers, academics and managers have all come to suffer from something akin to physics envy, which has resulted in the fetishization of measurement. This has given rise to the peculiar belief that the methods of empirical positivist science that have been so spectacularly successful in the study of the inanimate universe are also applicable to the study of sentient, self-reflexive Kantian beings called humans and their institutions. All kinds of peculiarities are decreed to be measurable by the device of allocating them a number. The appearance of numbers creates the illusion that we are in the realm of objectivity. These pseudo-numbers get bundled together using rationales that are closer to numerology than mathematics to produce pseudo-scores and performance indicators. And it becomes crucial for institutions to measure up to the required score, or they will be penalized. I mention this because performance indicators will come to play a role in what I'm about to talk about. So, in order to get a picture of your organization, of the kinds of people and where they are in the hierarchy and the structure of the organization, institutions produce ethnic monitoring forms, and here is one such, and the checklist is created by the legislature. You might well have done these, I'm sure they are familiar to you. And you're supposed to tick one of these. The very last thing not stated is not put on the form, and I'll come to the reason for that a bit later. But first, what a strange mishmash of categories this form consists of. 2 colours, a continent, a nation, and most disturbing of all, an idea of people who are allegedly mixed. By countenancing a notion of mixed in the legislature as one of the categories of ethnicity, the legislature gives succor to the races as it implies that there exist ethnicities that are unmixed or pure. We have to ask, where and when in this world has there ever been an unmixed ethnicity? The same question is to be asked of the categories race and heritage. We readily speak of mixed race and mixed heritage, but where and when has there ever existed a pure race? Only in the mind of the racist. But the thing is, self-ascription, this is a form that I fill out about my ethnic identity. This self-ascription has a validity, but actually it misses the point. Because racism, sexism, prejudice and the like are not driven so much by what I think myself to be, but what you take me to be, particularly if you are more powerful than me. It matters little if a person thinks of themselves primarily as Cambridge graduate or lawyer or middle class and so on, if they are perceived first and foremost by the more powerful as Jew, Arab, black, woman. And this is the point, treated on that basis. There are many issues with this form, but another issue is that in critical ways, this ethnic monitoring form actually comes to bolster the processes of racialization, as it dooms certain kinds of people to eternal otherness. So imagine a person called Jayanti, and her progenitors came to the UK some generations ago, say. And say this person, Jayanti, thinks of herself as British. Well, on this form, because she cannot call herself white British, she's manacled forever to one of the other two categories, Asian British or black British, and so remains literally in the antechamber and never ever quite really British. I'm not saying, by the way, that such persons ought to experience themselves as simply British. I am saying that if they did, then the questionnaire would give them no possibility of claiming that identity. So in this way, the ethnic monitoring form pushes people further into further racializing themselves as well as others. In the current situation, it becomes imperative to be known and to be recognized by the legislature as a particular kind of people. This is because once a category comes to be officially recognized as such, then not only does it gain a legitimacy in public discourse, but now, as an entity, it is also deemed to have certain rights in relation to other similar entities. You are only counted, and therefore you only count, when you are a certain kind of human being. But we know that academic researchers and bureaucrats have become dexterous in the dark arts of manipulating situations and spinning statistics to sing the song they wanted to sing. So here are two examples. And the first is to do with the last point on this form, which is not put on the form. Well, the reason it's not put on this form is because there is no legal obligation on people to fill in this form. So if you put it on the form, it's likely that some people will tick it. And the consequences of this are spelt out in instructions sent out to institutions by the Department of Health and Social Care. And they say this: high proportions of not stated codes have an adverse effect on the overall data quality indicator, and hence on the organization's overall performance. So if too many people choose not to answer this question, this will lower the DQI score, and this in turn will lower the performance of the institution. What we are witnessing here is the needs of the organization trumping the rights of the individuals that it is supposed to be serving. In proceeding in this way, the performance indicator is about pseudo-performance, and performance in the service of being seen to do good rather than actually doing good. Ethics is visibly absent in this scenario. Here is the second example. Following 9/11 and 7/11, the British government introduced a series of counter-terrorism measures, the most infamous of which was called Section 44. Consequently, the police were no longer obliged to have explicit grounds for stopping and searching anyone in the street. Before, they had to have grounds, they had to have reason. So in 2007, it became clear that in the absence of these sorts of checks, Black and Asian people were being disproportionately targeted by the police. In other words, they were practicing a form of unfair discrimination and falling foul of the Race Relations Acts. The police's way of dealing with the situation was not to reduce the frequency of stopping and searching the dark folk in the street, but to increase the number of white folk they stopped and searched. By this means, they cooked and balanced their statistical books. Lord Carlisle was furious. If 50 blonde women who are stopped who fall nowhere near any intelligence-led terrorism profile, it's a gross invasion of the civil liberties of those 50 blonde women. Lord Carlisle will appear to be less troubled by a similar invasion of civil liberties of hundreds of thousands of darker, non-blonde folk, because obviously they must all fall within the intelligence-led terrorism profile. Another case of they all look the same. I'm now going to turn my attention to the sorts of ways institutions try to implement changes with changes in the culture of the institution. So the Race Relations Acts oblige institutions to put resources into ensuring that the culture of the institution is inclusive and so forth. And one of the ways that institutions do this is they put their employees through mandatory trainings, and very often they're computerized trainings. And the one I'm going to speak to is a computerized training in Devon in equality and diversity. It takes a couple of hours to do this training, and the rationale behind these trainings is an anodyne multiculturalist one, as you can see from the introduction to the training written by the chair of the Commission on Racial Equality. And it's all about lack of knowledge, and if we learn more about other people, we will treat them better. It's that old saw. Anyway, at the conclusion of the training, the employees tested. The computer reassures them, if you don't pass on the first attempt, don't worry, you can have another go. A colleague tells me that a member of the team she works for kept failing this test because in her view, gypsies and travellers did not constitute a distinct ethnicity. Whether one agrees with her or not is not the point, and she does not hold this view because she is stupid and does not understand the arguments. She simply has a different opinion. But she will only pass the test when her thinking conforms to the party line. What has happened to the idea of respecting all differences? In the same training, we find the pious claim that the intention of the training is not to instill political correctness or tell people what to think. It clearly is. And there'll be considerable pressure on this woman from her bosses to press the correct answer, because if she does not, the computer will deem her to have failed, and that in turn will have a detrimental effect on the organization's performance score. So if and when she does finally press the button, it will be out of exhaustion and compliance. These trainings consist of infantile information like this. It's advisable to ask for people's first names and so forth. And the tests consist of questions like this. So imagine you've spent 2 hours going through this. So if you hate or fear particular kinds of people for whatever reason, this kind of inane training is surely not going to change that. And surely this is obvious to everyone. So why are almost all statutory organisations insistent that all their employees spend untold hours doing these tokenistic trainings? This is just one. There are about 10 that people are obliged to do. Think of the 5.7 million people working in the public sector, each spending 2 hours on this training. Then multiply that by 10. That's the equivalent of about 7,000 people working a full-time year, enough to staff a hospital. So it's evident this so-called training is not going to change the mind of anyone. This sort of idiocy seems to think that racism and the like are due to faulty cognition. Simply give them the facts and they will change their minds because they are rational. To my mind, this kind of tokenistic training is simply a cheap way of complying with the requirements of the law and has to do with the defensive mentality of bureaucracies generally. Having put their employees through these trainings, the institution is deemed to have done its duty and complied with the law. A box has been ticked. Now, if an employee were to act, say, in a racist way, the institution can wash its hands, claiming it has put them through the training, so the problem as such lies in that individual. The only way such trainings, and I think the term training is the wrong word here, but just to use it, the only way that such trainings can be meaningful rather than tokenistic is if they took place face to face, in which case they will be much more expensive and time consuming. There will be argument and there will be tension. There will be anger and there will be fear. There will be hurt and there will be remorse. And most of all, there will be no neat agreement between the participants at the conclusion of the so-called training. When diversity consultants are not telling organizations how to make more money out of the marginalized, they're giving them lessons in sensitivity and etiquette and how not to cause offense to others. Clements and Spinks say this in their Equal Opportunities Handbook. By the time you have considered the issues in this book, you will have developed greater sensitivity to what might be offensive. They say that their aim is to enable the reader behave towards everyone with fairness, courtesy and sensitivity. Their course teaches the reader a set of 6 transferable skills, and they are empathy, understanding, raised awareness, sensitivity, the desire to be fair, and so on. But these are not skills, these are moral attitudes. What we're witnessing in these so-called sensitivity trainings is the instrumentalization of the emotions as well as ethics. They draw on a personal growth model, and they say, we would encourage you to examine your beliefs, attitudes, values regarding others who are different to you, to dig underneath layers of defense and justification built up over the years. This inner exploration, they claim, will lead the more powerful to becoming less prejudiced and inviting others into their workplace. This, of course, is a possibility. However, despite the personal growth model having been used in organizations for some decades, there has been little real change. Following a training like this, an organization might put aside a room for the purposes of prayer by devout Muslims in their employ. But in my view, this kind of cultural courtesy is no more than patronage by another name. If institutions were really serious about attending to the needs of their marginalized employees, one of the things that would make the biggest impact would be the provision of a creche. And this, it has to be pointed out, has nothing exotic or mysterious about it. Another key element in these trainings is in the territory of language, and how to use language in order not to cause offense to others. And there is much that is sensible about it. For example, making it clear that sexist or racially abusive language is unacceptable in the workplace. But there are other aspects which are not so sensible, even though they begin from a sensible place. For example, it is true that language is not just a passive means of apprehending a pre-existing reality, but it is critically active in forming and informing that reality. Informing and informing the way that reality comes to be apprehended. Language structures experience. You'd agree with that. But the next steps lead us into a conceptual morass. For example, in a well-regarded book aimed at the training of social workers in Britain, the author Thompson notes that people belonging to the category the elderly are unfairly discriminated against. However, the issue for Thompson is the categorization process itself. He says, terms such as the elderly, the old, are commonly used but are nonetheless very dehumanizing. They depersonalize the people to whom they refer. He goes on to say We should avoid grouping people together according to age, abandon the us-them mentality. His sequence is this. Categories create a them who are then marginalized. Therefore, don't categorize. If you don't name them, then they won't exist as a separate category from us, and so they cannot be marginalized. We are being led into a 1984 land, trying to adjust reality by adjusting the words used to describe it. I agree that the elderly are often treated in shabby ways. They are the them to the mainstream us. But to then suggest that one should not utilize these categories is, to my mind, nonsensical. It seems obvious that the term, the category, is useful precisely because they have very particular and specific needs. Surely society ought to be discriminating in favour of them receiving more resources of a certain kind than the rest of us. So here's this argument around the elderly, which is don't name them and all will be well. But now when it comes to other categories like black or Muslim or Jew and so on, the game changes. Now, Thompson brings up the diversity philosophy to say that what we should do, he says, is to emphasize the differences between individuals and across groups, because such differences are best seen as assets to be valued. So why does the argument that apply to the elderly not apply to Jews, women, or black people, and so on? Well, in my view, the reason behind this anomaly is the mistaken belief that some groups, like the elderly, are merely artifacts of thinking, whilst other groupings, like black or Muslim, have a real objective existence. What they are blind to, precisely because they take no account of politics and power relations, is the reason why it seems some sorts of groupings are objective and real, and others are not. If a grouping comes to militate for its members, black power, gay rights, and so on, then it comes to have a reality and presence that it did not have before. What we are speaking of here is the social construction of identity. Well, an identity might be English. But the thing is, just by the very use of the phrase English culture, say, I create the illusion of coherence and uniformity. And when I look in any depth at so-called English culture, it disintegrates into a number of conflicting and overlapping practices and beliefs from royalist, Protestant, left-wing radical, and so on. Islam has its bloody feuds between Shia, Sunni, and there are other Muslims who are totally disinterested in it. The untouchables' experience of Hindu culture is radically different from that of the Brahmin. So I cannot simply tolerate their culture, because there are varieties of conflictual cultures within them. Here is the thing. Cultural practices and beliefs are, amongst other things, institutionalized rationales of domination and oppression. Cultural beliefs and practices are sedimented power relations. And perhaps the most vivid example of this is the caste system as it exists in India. Cultural practices explain why it is only men that might become priests, why it is right and proper that the genitalia of women should be mutilated, and why one kind of person is entitled to resources and another is not. Those who are beneficiaries of the ways that a culture is structured, and mostly they tend to be conservative bearded men, they use a version of culturalism to defend oppressive cultural practices on the ground that they are our culture, and so you have no voice in it. In the main, in almost all cultures, this is the women folk who find themselves at the wrong end of things. In the face of this sort of reality, what of the organizational policy that insists that it is ethical to tolerate and celebrate differences from us? Not to do so is made a disciplinary offence. What should I do in a circumstance where some of their ways offend me because I think them unethical? But notice again, there is no universal them, as there is no universal us. Not every Muslim, not every Christian is caught up in murderous sectarian feuds. They are not all the same, and nor are we. By the way, who is this we that I keep referring to? Are you a part of this we? Who decides? You, me, or someone else altogether? To repeat again, there are multiple differences between each of us, and at the same time, multiple similarities. And it comes about that one or other of these differences or similarities becomes so powerfully present in a particular context, so powerfully present that it creates the illusion of different kinds of people. Human groupings are not found, but made. I would say this, that there's nothing intrinsically different about the differences that we think make a difference. This is why I cannot simply respect their culture, because theirs is not just one culture, but many conflicting cultures. There's no universal spokesperson for the Islamic community in the UK. There are only spokespersons for specific interest groups, some religious, some fundamentalist, others secular and liberal. Whether I realise it or not, I somehow decide what to tolerate and what not to. And the basis of this is my ethical sensibility, my sense of right and wrong. But my sense of the rightness of things is largely born out of the discourses that I'm born into and inhabit and absorb in unconscious ways. It follows then that the exercise of tolerance requires the engagement of one's discriminatory processes. Tolerance is not the opposite of discrimination. Indiscriminate tolerance of the kind that the diversity celebrators advocate is dangerous nonsense. No. These statements, inclusivity statements, equal opportunity statements and so on, that are put out by institutions, in my view, they are examples of what George Herbert Mead has called cult values. Now, cults hold unrealistic beliefs about the world and their place in it and how it works and so on. And Mead argues that many of our day-to-day unreflected practices are in fact cult values. That we think they're true and we act as if they're true, but they're not. And there are many such cult values in organizational life. For example, inclusivity. Because even as I include one thing, I necessarily exclude another, as I'm continually doing in my uses of us and we as I speak. In respecting one, I'm inevitably disrespecting another. In this black and white world, faced with these Platonic ideals, one has failed before one has even begun. Because of this, one is inherently and eternally vulnerable to some accusation or another. The rosy glow given off by the rhetoric serves two insidious functions. For one thing, it comes to mask the processes of marginalization that continue to flourish. And second, the impossibility of measuring up to the rhetoric becomes the means of coercion and control. These procedures and protocols that were primarily created to deal with misdemeanors also come to be applied indiscriminately to those who are incompetent, to those who are irresponsible, as well as those who make errors of judgment. To the lazy, indifferent, bureaucratic mindset, wrong is wrong. Well, the reason why institutions act in these draconian ways is that they are afraid of being punished and penalized by the state. When accused, their first defense tends to be, we cannot be accused of any wrongdoing because we have complied fully with the regulations. Sherry spoke to this yesterday. When this strategy fails, then institutions sacrifice some of their own, the bad apples. The innocent often sacrificed along with the guilty. Bureaucracies have replaced Kant's ethical injunction to think for ourselves with compliance. It now becomes dangerous to think. Safety lies in compliance, in rule following. Procedures are designed to comply with the legislature, and employees are required to adhere to these procedures. Do this, and all will be well. Deviate from procedure, and you are disciplined, even if your reasons for having done so are ethically sincere and you think you are doing right. The fate of whistleblowers being a key example. So I near my conclusion. I should say that I'm not against procedures and protocols per se. I recognize their necessity. What I'm against is the use of procedure as mindless directives, as a means of replacing thinking with flowchart following. The only way that I could embrace a difference that was antithetical to my ethical sensibility, which the diversity promulgators would have me do by redefining this difference as an asset. The only way I could do this would be to repress and cut off from my sense of right and wrong. If I did this, what would I have become? Would I still be me? Ought I to try to be relentlessly positive towards all differences? I think not. Because to do so is to collapse the distinction between being deliberately offensive and causing offense, as well as the distinction between judgmentalism, which is moralistic, and judgment, which is both ethical and necessary. I also think that the aims of HR departments could do with being a bit more modest and not feed the myth that equality heaven is readily achievable, because these myths and absolutist claims lend themselves to being used in the service of intimidation and control. All these things work towards generating thought and action paralysis. We increasingly find ourselves in a upside-down 1984 world where words do not mean what we think they mean and where vindictive actions are defended as ethical. I end my paper with one such example, of which there are many. Keep in mind, as you hear the story, that all the protagonists in the story, the police, the Home Office officials, the immigration authorities, they will all have been put through numerous equality and diversity trainings. Their institutions will have produced equality schemes and vision statements that proclaim the dignity of all human beings and so on. There will be in place complaint procedures available to the general public and disciplinary procedures for the employees. There will be government ombudsmen whose task it is to ensure that these organisations comply with government directives. All that is in place. In 2008, Tula Mia, a British subject, was picked up in London, in a London street, as he was acting strangely. When asked his name, he gave a false name. The police and Home Office officials thought him to be the failed Pakistani asylum seeker, Bilal Ahmed. They did this despite ample evidence to the contrary staring them in the face. Mia, the person they had in front of them, was 2 inches taller than Ahmed, and he looked entirely different. He spoke Bengali and not Urdu. He had on his person a bank card in his name. In jail, a doctor examined him for 15 minutes and found him to be of sound mind and therefore he was presumed to be lying. He was put on a plane to Pakistan. In actual fact, he was suffering from and under treatment for schizophrenia. The Pakistani police tortured him for several days, trying to get him to answer their questions. He could not answer them, as he did not speak their language. He was eventually returned to Britain, disturbed, disorientated, and traumatized. On his return, he was kept in hospital for a couple of days, after which the immigration officers gave him a £5 note and left him in Terminal 4 at Heathrow Airport. It was 3 days later that this bewildered individual somehow managed to contact his family. Well, unsurprisingly, the Mia family brought a case of racial discrimination against the Home Office. The Home Office's first response was denial, asserting that immigration officers acted in good faith. The UK Border Agency also defended itself. The UK Border Agency carries out all removals with dignity and compassion and takes very seriously any claim that proper procedures have not been followed. Notice, procedures. Because all procedures have apparently been followed, there can be no wrongdoing. Well, just as the case was about to go to the High Court, the Home Office capitulated and settled out of court. But as a condition of the settlement, the family and lawyers were not allowed to say that a settlement had even been reached, nor what its terms were. The authorities used money, our money, the taxpayers' money, to silence the litigants and rob them of their capacity and right to free speech. So much for ethics, so much for equality. It seems to me that many of the contradictions within the equality discourses are there because they are a reflection of difficulties that already exist at a fundamental level in contemporary ways of thinking about human beings in organizational life. At the heart of these difficulties is the capitalist belief that the human being is a commodity that is there to be manipulated and controlled, in tandem with the cognitivist belief that the human being is a machine-like entity who can be trained to think and feel and act in specific ways for specific ends. There is no clear, straightforward solution to the situation we find ourselves in regards to inequality. When things go awry, as they are bound to, instead of resorting to the mindless operation of punitive procedure, something akin to the activity of ethical engagement needs to be called for. This engagement is likely to be conflictual and unequal because of the power relations and the offices held by the protagonists. But it is all we have. And the situation remains complex. And what we have to resist are three dangers. First, that of psychologizing and individualizing the difficulties. The second danger is of imagining that the difficulties are amenable to being addressed through rational cognitive proceduralization. And last, we should resist the simplifications and relentless positivity being foisted on us by the celebrators of diversity. That's it. Thank you.